Imagine, you have lost an empire, lost your capital, lost your throne. Your enemies are celebrating. Your allies have abandoned you. Your story is considered over. And yet one evening, you board a small ship, leave your island of exile, and set off toward the nearly impossible. That is exactly what Napoleon Bonaparte did. The year 1815 became one of the most dramatic, not only in his life, but in all of European history. In just over 100 days, he would travel from exile to Emperor of France, from a triumphant return to a final great battle that would forever change the fate of the continent. This is a story about risk, about faith, about ambition, and about one man's last attempt to challenge the entire world. After his defeat in 1814, Napoleon was sent to the island of Elba, a barely visible speck in the Mediterranean Sea. The victors believed it would be enough. The former ruler of much of Europe received his own small island and the title of emperor without an empire. His kingdom now consisted of a few thousand inhabitants, a small administration, and around 1,000 loyal soldiers. His career seemed finished, but the Allies underestimated one crucial thing. Napoleon was still closely monitoring events in France, and the news was promising. The Bourbons had returned to the French throne. Louis XVIII was trying to restore the monarchy as it had existed before the Revolution. Former nobles were reclaiming their privileges. Among army officers, discontent was growing. Thousands of veterans of the Grande Armée felt betrayed. They had shed their blood from Spain to Moscow and now watched their sacrifices being gradually forgotten. Peasants feared losing the land they had received after the Revolution. The middle classes were frustrated by economic hardship. France was growing tired of the new regime. Napoleon understood this perfectly. Every day brought him letters from supporters, officials, officers, politicians, former comrades. All reported the same thing. If he returned, he still had a chance. In late February 1815, Napoleon made a decision, perhaps the most audacious decision of his life. On the evening of February 26th, a secret operation began in the port of Elba. About 1,000 loyal soldiers, veterans of the Imperial Guard, Polish lancers, artillerists, received orders to prepare for departure. They understood the risk clearly. If the expedition failed, all of them faced death or life imprisonment. British ships patrolled the waters ahead. The Mediterranean was controlled by the Allied fleet, but it was precisely on such audacious ventures that Napoleon had built his legend. The ships sailed north through the night. On March 1st, 1815, the French coastline appeared on the horizon, the Gulf of Juan, near Caen. It was here that one of the boldest political operations in history began. Napoleon stepped ashore with just 1,000 men. Ahead lay an entire country. Behind him, the sea. There was no turning back. Rather than moving along the coast, he chose a route through the mountains, more difficult, but avoiding strong government garrisons. The column moved slowly northward, and villages greeted them with astonishment. The man who was already spoken of as a page in history was walking the roads of France again. News spread like lightning. The government in Paris began to panic. Troops were dispatched to intercept him. Ministers demanded his immediate arrest. The king was convinced the revolt would be quickly crushed. After all, the entire state stood against Napoleon. The army stood against him. The law stood against him. All of Europe stood against him. But they did not yet understand the most important thing. Napoleon had returned not merely as a man, but as a symbol, and that symbol still held enormous power over French society. The decisive moment came on March 7th, near the town of Laffrey, not far from Grenoble. A battalion of the 5th Line Infantry Regiment blocked his path. Regular French troops with a clear order. Stop Bonaparte. If necessary, open fire. Napoleon halted his men. He gave no order to prepare for battle. Instead, he did something that shocked everyone present. Alone, unguarded, he walked forward. Slowly approaching the line of muskets, Napoleon stopped a few dozen meters from the barrels. Then he unbuttoned his gray coat, opened his chest, and spoke words that would enter history forever. "Soldiers, if there is any man among you who wishes to shoot his emperor, here I am." Silence fell. For several seconds, no one moved. The soldiers looked at the man before them. Many had served under his command. Many had fought alongside him in dozens of battles. They remembered Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram, even the terrible march to Moscow. Then a cry rang out from the ranks. Then another. And suddenly, hundreds of voices merged into one. "Long live the Emperor!" The muskets were lowered. Soldiers rushed forward. Some wept, some laughed. Some simply reached out to touch the man they considered a legend. Instead of an arrest, Napoleon had gained a new army. This moment was the turning point. From here, events moved with the speed of an avalanche. Garrison after garrison began switching sides. Officers hesitated. The news of Marshal Ney, who had promised the king to bring Napoleon to Paris in an iron cage, only to join him with his troops, sent shockwaves through the royal court. On March 20th, 1815, Napoleon's carriage entered the Tuileries Palace, the same palace he had left after his abdication in 1814. Just 20 days earlier, he had been a castaway on a small island in the middle of the sea. Now he was Emperor of France again. Behind the celebrations in France, Europe's response was swift and merciless. In Vienna, where the Congress of Victorious Powers was still in session, the news of Napoleon's return caused genuine shock. For months, European diplomats had been quarreling over new borders, territories, and the balance of power. Now all secondary disputes instantly lost their significance. A common enemy had appeared. On March 13th, even before Napoleon entered Paris, the great powers officially declared him a disturber of the peace and placed him outside the law. This was an unprecedented step. The war was not declared against France. It was declared personally against Napoleon Bonaparte. Days later, the states formed a new military coalition, the Seventh: Great Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, and dozens of smaller allies. All agreed on one thing: Napoleon had to be removed once and for all. No compromises, no negotiations, no second chances. For Napoleon, this meant only one thing: time was running out. France had not recovered from the previous wars. The economy was exhausted. Warehouses were empty. Many veterans had perished in Russia, Germany, and France itself. He set to work with incredible energy, reviewing troops, restoring headquarters, recalling experienced officers, calling veterans back to the colors. Soon, hundreds of thousands of men were under his command. But the problem was not only numbers. Many recruits had no combat experience. There were not enough horses, not enough equipment, not enough time. The emperor understood the reality perfectly. If the Allies invaded France simultaneously from all sides, the country would not hold out. The only chance was a swift, decisive strike, to crush opponents one by one, before their enormous armies could unite. Napoleon fixed his attention on Belgium, where the two nearest Allied armies were stationed. To the north were the forces of British Field Marshal Arthur Wellesley, Duke of Wellington, the same commander who had fought the French for years in Spain. Nearby stood another dangerous force, the Prussian army of Field Marshal Gebhard von Blücher. The old Prussian commander hated Napoleon with such intensity that the Allies considered him one of France's most resolute enemies. If Wellington and Blücher united, their combined strength would far exceed the French. Napoleon's plan was simple in concept and breathtaking in boldness. Cross the border quickly, drive between the two armies, destroy each one separately, then force Europe to the negotiating table. On the morning of June 15, 1815, the French army crossed into Belgium. The last campaign of Napoleon had begun. Before dawn on June 15th, the French army was already in motion. The roads of Belgium filled with endless columns of infantry, cavalry, and artillery. The thunder of thousands of hooves mixed with the grinding of gun carriages. Napoleon's goal was clear: wedge himself between the armies of Wellington and Blücher, prevent them from joining forces, and destroy each one separately. The opening hours went well. French forces captured key crossings and pushed back Allied advance guards, but both commanders reacted quickly, drawing their forces toward key positions. On June 16th, the fate of the campaign began to be decided in two places simultaneously. At Ligny, Napoleon personally engaged Blücher's Prussian army, some 84,000 Prussians against around 68,000 French. The battlefield quickly filled with smoke. Artillery thundered. Infantry fought bitterly over every village. Blücher, over 70 years old, behaved as though he were a young officer, personally moving among his soldiers and throwing reserves into the most dangerous spots. By evening, Napoleon delivered a decisive blow. The French guard broke through the center of the Prussian line. Positions began to collapse. Blücher himself narrowly escaped capture. His horse fell during an attack, pinning the old marshal to the ground. Only by a miracle was he saved by his own soldiers. The Prussian army retreated. On the surface, it looked like a great victory for Napoleon. But there was one critical problem. The Prussians retreated in an organized fashion. They were not destroyed, not scattered, not demoralized. They remained a serious force, and this fact would very soon prove decisive. Meanwhile, several kilometers away at Quatre Bras, Marshal Ney was ordered to prevent Wellington from joining with Blücher. On paper, the task seemed feasible. In reality, it proved far more difficult. Ney acted cautiously, wasting precious time and failing to deliver a decisive blow before Allied reinforcements steadily arrived. The battle ended in a draw, and that draw shattered a significant part of Napoleon's plan. Wellington remained on the field. His army was not destroyed. It could still fight. That evening, June 16th, Napoleon received mixed news. Victory at Ligny, but no breakthrough at Quatre Bras. He still had a chance, but now he had to act immediately. Wellington, learning of Blücher's retreat, pulled his army back to a new defensive position near a small Belgian village. Waterloo. The terrain was favorable for defense. A low ridge concealed most of his troops from French artillery. Ahead stood farms and fortified buildings, most importantly, Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte, that would become the keystones of the coming battle. Through the night of June 17th, rain poured without stopping. Soldiers slept in the open. Clothes were soaked through. Many could not sleep, thinking of glory or of death. Far to the east, Blücher was rallying his battered forces, and it was there that the old Prussian field marshal made a promise to Wellington that would change the course of history. I will come, even if I must lead my army on its last strength. June 18th, 1815. Dawn over the Belgian fields was gray and cold. All night it had rained. The earth had become heavy mud. Every soldier's step left a deep print in the soaking ground. For tens of thousands of men, this was the morning that would decide the fate of Europe. Napoleon rose before sunrise and carefully surveyed the field of the coming battle. Ahead on the heights stood Wellington's army, some 68,000 soldiers. British, Dutch, Belgians, Germans. The French numbered approximately 72,000. Infantry, cavalry, and the legendary veterans of the Guard. On paper, the forces were nearly equal. But there was one problem. Blucher. If the Prussians arrived on the battlefield in time, the French position would become critical. Napoleon needed to finish the battle before they came. Because of the waterlogged ground, he delayed the start of the attack. Cannonballs would simply bury themselves in the mud, rather than ricocheting through enemy ranks. Those lost hours, which many historians later called one of the main causes of defeat, would never be recovered. Around 11:30, the first artillery shots rang out over the field. The Battle of Waterloo had begun. The first French blow was directed at the farm of Hougoumont. What on the map appeared to be a secondary objective became a true inferno. French infantry threw themselves forward. The British Guard defended every wall, every courtyard, every door with desperate stubbornness. At one point, French soldiers even broke inside, but the defenders quickly shut the gates, and those who had entered were nearly all cut down. Throughout the day, Hougoumont swallowed thousands of French soldiers, transforming from a diversionary attack into a grinding slaughter. Around 1 in the afternoon, Napoleon ordered d'Erlon's corps to assault the center of the Allied army. Thousands of French infantrymen formed into enormous columns. Drums beat the rhythm, flags waved above the ranks. The entire mass began to move forward, like a giant wave. Some British units began to fall back. It seemed as though Wellington's center was about to break. But at that moment, the Allies delivered a surprise blow. British heavy cavalry charged into the French columns. Giants on powerful horses crashed into the infantry. Chaos erupted. French ranks dissolved. Hundreds of men fell within minutes. The attack faltered. The breakthrough did not happen. Then came the first alarming news. On the horizon, new troops were spotted. At first, no one was certain who they were. Then it became clear. Prussians. Blucher had kept his promise. Napoleon immediately reacted, redirecting a portion of his forces to the right flank where the Prussian columns were approaching. Now the French were fighting on two fronts, and the situation was growing more dangerous by the hour. Around 4 in the afternoon came one of the most controversial moments of the entire battle. Marshal Ney noticed a movement in the Allied lines and concluded that Wellington was beginning to retreat. Without waiting for clear orders, he launched the French cavalry. Thousands of horsemen surged forward, cuirasses flashing in the sun, sabers raised. It was one of the largest cavalry charges of the 19th century. But Wellington was not retreating. His infantry instantly formed squares, box formations bristling with bayonets on all sides, nearly impenetrable for cavalry alone. The French horsemen crashed into these squares again and again. One charge, a second, a fifth, a 10th. The result was the same. Without infantry and artillery support, the attacks were doomed. Thousands of horses and riders fell under musket fire. France's precious cavalry was melting before everyone's eyes. On the eastern flank, fighting with the Prussians was becoming increasingly fierce. Napoleon began to understand the terrible truth. Time was working against him. Around 7 in the evening, the decisive moment arrived. The battlefield was drowning in smoke. Thousands of wounded lay between the positions. The artillery fired almost without pause. Napoleon looked toward the Allied center. If a decisive blow was not delivered now, the battle was lost. And so he made a decision. The last trump card, the last reserve, the last hope. The old guard would attack, the elite of the French army. Legendary veterans, men who for decades had been considered undefeatable. Soldiers whose names all of Europe knew. Slowly and steadily, they began climbing the slope. Bullets whistled around them. Cannon thundered, but the guard kept moving forward. French soldiers watched them with hope. Many believed, if the guard breaks through the center, the battle can still be saved. But Wellington had hidden his finest units behind the crest of the ridge. As the guard climbed, the Allied troops lay on the reverse slope, invisible to the French. Then they rose. A volley rang out, then another, and another. The blow was devastating. The front ranks of the Guard began to fall. Veterans tried to hold their formation, but casualties mounted rapidly. The British fire grew denser. The French pushed forward, slowed, tried to attack again, but they were losing momentum, losing men, losing strength, losing hope. At that moment, the Allies counterattacked. British infantry swept forward. New units pressed from the flanks. For the first time in many years, the old Guard began to retreat. For the French army, this was an unimaginable shock. A legend existed. The Guard never retreats. When word swept through the French ranks that the Guard was falling back, the army's morale collapsed. First individual units withdrew, then entire battalions. Then came the panic. Across the battlefield, one cry spread: "Save yourselves!" At that very moment, the final blow fell. Blücher's Prussian army broke through the positions near Plancenoit. Fresh thousands poured onto the field. The numerical advantage of the Allies became overwhelming. The French army could hold no longer. Around 8 in the evening, Wellington ordered a general advance. The entire Allied line moved forward. The French front disintegrated. Columns dissolved. Guns were abandoned. The roads filled with fleeing men. The battle was over. Napoleon had lost. Finally, irreversibly, Wellington would later call Waterloo the hardest day of my life. For Napoleon, it was the day an entire era ended. Through the night, he left the battlefield. The man whose armies had once dictated their will to all of Europe was now trying to save the remnants of his forces. On the road to Paris, he still hoped to find a way out, perhaps form a new army, perhaps force the Allies to negotiate. But reality left no chance. France was exhausted. Politicians were sick of war. Even many of his supporters understood that it was over. On June 22, 1815, Napoleon abdicated for the second time. He tried to transfer power to his son, Napoleon II, but the Allies had no intention of recognizing a new Bonaparte emperor. The dynasty had to disappear forever. On July 15th, in one of the most symbolic scenes of his life, Napoleon voluntarily boarded the British warship HMS Bellerophon. The former master of Europe was surrendering to his most determined enemies. He expressed hope for British hospitality, perhaps asylum, perhaps a quiet private life. But the British government had other plans. This time, no Elba, no risk of another return, no second chance. The chosen place was the island of St. Helena, a tiny scrap of land in the middle of the South Atlantic, thousands of kilometers from Europe, from France, from power. In October 1815, Napoleon arrived on the island. There he would spend the final years of his life, writing his memoirs, remembering his victories and his defeats, the people who had stood by him, and those who had betrayed him. Meanwhile, in Europe, a new era was beginning, an era without Napoleon. 23 years of almost continuous war had finally ended. Millions had died. Entire states had changed their borders. Old empires had fallen. New forces had risen. But Napoleon's influence did not vanish with his exile. His laws, his reforms, his ideas, his vision of the state. All of this would continue to shape the future of Europe for decades. Waterloo destroyed the empire. But it could not destroy the legend. That is why, even today, more than 2 centuries later, the name Napoleon remains one of the most recognized in all of human history. And after the emperor's fall, a new question confronted the European powers: how to build an order that would prevent such a thing from ever happening again. How to preserve peace after decades of war. How to rebuild an entire continent. The answers would be given by the monarchs and diplomats gathered in Vienna. There, a new political map of Europe would be born. There, the Holy Alliance would be created, And there, the history after Napoleon would begin. But that is the subject of our next chapter.